Hello, and welcome to the latest installment in our UXDX online series. We have another fantastic lineup for you tonight, and I hope you're really excited to listen to our speakers. But before we jump in, I want to give you a very quick introduction to what it is we do at UXDX and why we host these sessions. So at UXDX, our mission is to help companies shift from building software through waterfall projects to using autonomous empowered product teams. And the reason why that's our mission is because it's a more effective, efficient, and sustainable way of working when you're working in a high change environment. So if you're working in a low change environment, sure, it makes sense. Spin up a team, solve a problem, disband them, move on to somewhere else. But I've worked in a lot of companies where there's hundreds, literally hundreds of projects ongoing at any given time. So you're never kind of moving off completely. Yes, you might move a project, but somebody else comes back into the space that you were just in. And if that's the case, it makes sense to have people who really understand the customer, understand the business objectives, and are able to iterate and innovate and kind of continuously improve and make sure that their product meets the needs of the customers. And that's where product teams come in. So that's nice and easy to say, oh, we'll just swap from projects to products, but it's really hard to do in practice. And that's why we host these events, because we want to get people to share their experiences with their slice of the kind of the entire system of product development and how they're making changes and making improvements. And hopefully that will inspire some questions in you as you're listening, because you're trying to think, how could I apply what I'm learning in my context and how can I take that back to where I'm working? So we will allow time at the end of all of our sessions to take questions. So if you're watching on UXDX, there's a chat box on the side of the screen here. If you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever, feel free to ask your questions through those platforms. We'll be monitoring those and we'll put those questions to the speakers. Sometimes we can get too many questions, and that's a good thing. But we do have a tight timeline tonight. If any questions we can't answer tonight, we do have the UXDX community Slack group. And in there's an Ask the Speakers channel. So anything we don't have time to get through tonight, we'll post those questions in there and we'll invite the speakers to come and answer those questions for you. And if you're watching this because it's being recorded and distributed later, then please feel free to go in there as well and ask questions wherever or whenever you're watching this from. So that's enough about me. You're not here to listen to me talk. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this evening. And Soundarya, who is a senior product manager at Meta, will be talking about how to say, I don't know, in a technical product space. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Soundarya. Over to you.
Everyone. I'm super excited to be here chatting with everybody and like talking through my experiences. If that picture was not big enough, I have another one here that's even bigger. For my introduction, apart from being a product designer, I'd also like to add a couple of other things, which is my soft skills. I love singing songs in languages I don't know, and I also love attempting handstands. I'm really bad at both of those things. But the one thing that I can confidently say that I'm good at is product design. And I absolutely love working in this field and learning from everybody. And also, I'm very excited to be here to be able to share my experiences. So today we're really looking at how do we bridge the gap to build better products faster, right? So one of the big things that I've had to face is about like how I don't know something, but I'm working within a product team that's moving really fast. And there's all these technical things that I need to onboard to very quickly. And one of the ways I would say that you identify that you're in this situation is when everyone around you sounds like they're speaking English, but they're really not. And I can talk a little bit more about this. What I mean is that when people are talking around you and you understand all the words, but they don't really make sense unless you're part of that product team, then that's a very good indicator that you're in a space that's very, very technical. For example, there was a product that we worked on that was called T-Volt. And the way we described the product was that it was to simplify the process of secrets management. Now, I'm sure all of you know all of the words on this page, but what does it really mean? There was an explanation for it. They said T-Vault simplifies the access management of secrets by hiding all the integrity details. All the functionality available via the web UI is exposed via APIs, and documentation is available from within the UI. Again, we know all of the words, but none of this makes sense. Maybe it might make sense to the people who this is targeted towards, but most likely this definition only serves the product team that's working on it and building it, which what happens is it perpetuates this ambiguity around the product, which goes down all the way to the user, which is something we want to break down. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. Here are some of the ways that I've helped break that down. So the first thing I do is try to break down the buzzwords, right? And this would include things like secrets. What do they actually mean? They're talking, when they say secrets, they mean credentials, and they mean this is a service that manages credentials. But what does credentials also mean in this context? They were talking about certificates and API keys and things like that. But asking those questions basically triggered a line of questions which helped us understand the product a lot more. So sometimes you might feel like, oh, this seems like a very basic question. I can't go to the product owner and ask him, hey, what does that mean? Like, what does the secret manager mean? That is the most basic definition of the project. But I think what it does is it helps really like get alignment for everybody in the room. And it also helps clarify things and solidifies your understanding of what you're working on. Another example that was used in this project was called CRUD, right? And CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. Now, this is an industry-wide term for developers, and so it was fairly universal, I would say. But I think as your organization becomes bigger, there tends to be acronyms and abbreviations that apply only within those companies, and that's when it gets trickier. And you would only have it if you have like historical product knowledge. So when you're coming in new, I think it's a great time for you to step in and just say, hey, I would like more clarity on it, and get that clarification. The second thing that I do is try to map it to the real world. For example, right, with Vault. Vault simplifies the process of secrets management. Cloud application developers use it to find basically credentials from that service to integrate it back into their code. But this is very hard to wrap your head around. And if I'm going to be designing it for people, I need to be able to understand it. And so how do developers really use it? They basically go into this website and they'll search for keys out here, and they'll click on it and they'll check if it's the right key, and then they'll copy it and put it back into their code. Now, this was taking a lot of effort because we noticed that there's a lot of issues with this. There's a lot of UI and UX issues within this, but data was also telling us that developers were finding it thrice as hard to find something. So if they were looking for a key, they had to look for it at least 2 or 3 times before they found the right key. And so one really easy way that I found to like map this logic back was using an example. Think messy drawer in your house, right? And you're trying to find a mailbox key. And you know when you're opening the drawer, there's so many keys in there that it's going to take you at least a few times before you find the right one. That's kind of what was happening with the developers. Reframing it to this type of an analogy really helped simplify it and like make it more consistent across all of the team to use it. So when we were talking about things and explaining even our solutions, it became way easier to kind of socialize our thinking. The third one is to build an I don't know doc. This is really building an FAQ for yourself. And this you can do when you have more time. But basically what I do is I maintain a document where I write down my understanding of like the big questions that I might have. And the reason why this was helpful for me was when I found new parts of the project that related back to the old project or was based on the logic of older projects, it helped me make the connection for between the two. And it also helped me like recognize when I was making mistakes. If I saw something that was documented earlier on and I realized, oh, my understanding of it was not right, I was able to go back and pinpoint where I was making a mistake and where the logic was breaking. The fourth one is to find a BFF. I would say if you're working on a super technical space and if you're in the tech industry, find a dev or find someone who's a technical person. Because once they're your friend, you can ask them all of their silliest questions and you can keep asking them questions again and again. I've realized that this helps you really like build a relationship with them. And also over time, I think it also helps build trust. And it shows, I think, your technical partners that you're more invested in understanding how these systems work and building solutions for them rather than just thinking about it from an end experience point of view. The last one is channeling your inner Bob Ross. I think one of the things that's very unique that we bring to the table as designers is usually our visualization skills. And a lot of times, I feel like we have this power to really bring alignment to the team with just one document. And so, for example, with the T-Volt, one of the things that we wanted to show was around the site architecture and how it was causing confusion for the users. We talked about the keys and we talked about like how it was very hard for them to find it because they're looking for the keys in one drawer, multiple drawers. So all the all the elements on the left, which are like they're color coded, so each of those belong to like the same units, right? So all the safes are all green, the service accounts are purple, but you can see they're in different places. And even the way this is organized really doesn't have a lot of structure to it, which helped like show just how much confusion was being caused just by this site architecture. And so our proposal was to like basically clean it up and make it very, very straightforward. This really helps cement our like how we thought about the product and what we were pitching were not just UI solutions, but really like experience solutions. So these are like the high level summary of all of the things that I covered so far. I'm happy to take any questions. But before that, I also have the after. This is basically how we redesigned it. And what we did was from the before, we changed everything to long form text because we realized that a lot of the users were looking at like the end notes to see which was the right key. And then we also like changed the layout to a panel on the left instead of having it all up top so that we can create more more space. And then we also prioritize the search.
Great. So is that it, or are you?
I can go back and
no, I just
share anything specific in other spots.
Well, one question that I did have just going through it, and I thought some really, really good advice there about kind of, there are those acronyms that you just know when you've been somewhere, but the first time you hear them, it's always kind of daunting. But at that same time, when you're first hearing them, that's when people most likely have what people call imposter syndrome. So you're trying as best you can to look as competent as you can. So what advice do you give for people with how do you overcome that fear of saying, I don't know, when you're also battling your inner fear of being an imposter?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was very interesting for me to hear of late has been, like I think when I was younger in my career, I was really nervous about that too, right? Because you're trying very hard to seem like you know what's going on and to not come across as like you're very new to the field. And so that's kind of where it stems from. And I realized when I was talking to somebody like last month, just that there are so many things where like you might not know what the words mean, but you know your process and you know how to be a good designer and the foundation is there. And you might not know something that's relevant to this project, but you definitely have the skill set to apply the base foundation to it. And I think like remembering that is very crucial. And it's definitely very unnerving to be in a room full of experts and to be the person that's asking all the silly basic questions. But oftentimes, I think it really helps bring about clarity, not just for you, but for other people in the room. Because most likely, if you don't know something, there is a high chance that someone else in the room also doesn't know it, but they're just kind of afraid to, again, ask those questions. So I think you should just own the moment and go for it and ask it. And you're going to be a better designer for it, or a better product person for it.
Excellent. And just on that kind of did you call it a log or a diary, your I don't know log? Did you ever, because I've worked on a project where somebody came in and they took that initiative and we thought this is fantastic. So we actually published that on a kind of a project wiki, so that other people who, whether it was a new person joining our team or other people who would just every so often interact with our teams, and they found it a hugely valuable kind of cheat sheet.
Yeah.
Have you ever done something like that?
Yeah, there's actually a picture of it from the doc, but I guess it didn't show up in my deck. And I'm not sure if you can see it right now on the screen. Is it still showing?
Yep, I'm showing it now.
Yeah. So this was basically the doc I built, but there's like other docs that I built by each project. And you're right. Ultimately, I think that's what we end up using it as cheat sheets when like people onboard to the project or like they're onboarding to the company. They've often found it very easy to read from someone else's point of view and not just like something that's written as a help article, because we have access to those, right? But I think it goes back to like just taking like a human approach to describing these things. And I think when we write it to break it down for ourselves, it often helps other people. And it also like, I think there's a lot of value and it's very powerful when you write something down, because it forces you to think about the logic of things and it forces you to capture those gaps that might be missing when your brain is just jumping like, at like 10 times the speed.
Yeah, no, it is fantastic. And if anybody out there is just joining a team, I'd highly recommend doing something like this and then publishing it for everybody else to see as well. But yeah, no, the product looks great, because I know from my personal experience, key management is a nightmare. I absolutely hate it. And I often do the worst practice of checking my keys into my code, which is a very bad practice, but it's private repositories. I don't share them. But no, hopefully it is an area. I know AWS key management is a nightmare for me. So hopefully somebody can improve it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, key management is, that project was super fun to work on because it sounded so simple, but it was so complex, right? Until we like removed all the buzzwords from it and all the like acronyms from it. We were like, oh, this makes so much sense. This is like, sure, this I can solve as a problem. But like when we talk about like, getting keys and like copying those over and like creating new keys and like finding certificates and like, like all the privacy around it, like when it's shrouded in so much mystery, it just becomes like overwhelming to solve. So I think part of the effort was like breaking it down so it's just feels easy to solve.
Yeah. Actually, that's a great point that you brought up there, that I didn't touch on earlier. So this is probably quite a technical product, and there's a lot of kind of technical elements. And what I mean by that is, and I'm going to reference the recent LastPass troubles. If you're not familiar, they're a kind of a password management service that got hacked recently, and all of the customer passwords, encrypted passwords, were leaked. So when you were kind of learning and designing about this, was that kind of back-end zero knowledge kind of concept, was that being discussed about how much access the developers themselves had, and how did you tackle that as a designer?
Yeah, we actually looked at that too. We did like a case study on what the different like password managers did. And the ones that we looked at was the original HashiCorp which is what the T Vault was based on. We looked at AWS and we looked at LastPass, but we only looked at it from very much an experience point of view. So we looked at it from like, how are developers using this in their natural state? How are they, like, how fast do they want to use it and things like that, right? Because, for example, LastPass is consumer facing, but HashiCorp and T Vault is very much like a technical user focused. And so they're not really spending a lot of time in there because, we want to preserve that time to write code, like not to actually spend it looking for the keys, right? And so we looked at LastPass for maybe the ease of use, but not so much from a technical point of view.
And did that pose as a designer, because I'm assuming that there was a lot of, with the kind of password management, there's a big thing about the developers working on the code shouldn't even be able to see the passwords. So there should be kind of a zero knowledge of customer passwords. Did that kind of level of complexity from a technical side, did that ever kind of become a challenge for you as a designer? Or did that impact you at all?
So there's a slight variation there because LastPass, right, is for, let's say, people like you and me to save passwords for multiple services that we're using. Whereas T Vault is pretty much for people who are writing code and they need to get passwords for like the databases, right? So credentials for the databases. And so I don't think there's this so much, so because it's not like a consumer facing product, there isn't like that much like privacy and security concern, just because again, like these are all just like kind of being copied into code itself, right? And the other thing is also the users there are not really looking at the keys themselves, they're just going to copy them. So they don't stand to really gain anything from those keys as well, or like certificates. It's mostly to write code, and it's like within, like it's for software development basically, as opposed to LastPass, which is more like maintaining passwords for services or like login specifically.
Yeah. Okay, great. No, I was just wondering whether that was something that came up. But thanks very much for the presentation and the Q&A. Really appreciated it. So yeah, thanks once again.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the time.
Great. So that brings us over a little bit earlier than anticipated, but we're going to move on to our second talk of the evening. And this time it is Juhan, who is the managing director of GoInvo, and he'll be talking about its time for open source in healthcare. So welcome, Juhan.
Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Juhan.
So if you can just start sharing your screen, I'll put it up on.
Yeah, sharing that would help, wouldn't it? It helps if you're half a knucklehead. Okay, there we go.
All right, over to you now. Thanks very much.
Okay. I'm Juhan, and yes, I do work at a design studio in the Republic of Boston, and I do teach at an academic center in Cambridge. Because we're talking about healthcare, and there isn't enough disclosure about where our finances and where our biases are coming from, I list them here. Yes, my patents and all of my genome is open source. You can download it and plant it in the crime scene. If you want to get in touch with me, feel free to email me. I'll try to get back within a few business hours, and you can publicly critique me on the Musk mediocre machine. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about healthcare. I think it's a noble profession, and it has been for centuries, and yet here we have this idea that it has now become pretty noble business. Okay, so many of us, I think, are in the discipline now. It's been a huge sort of force for good over time, but we're using, I think, that nobility as an umbrella over some of the weird things that are happening in it. So where I live, in between the private equity firm called Harvard and the venture capital firm named MIT, this sort of 1 square mile in between the two occupies about 25% of healthcare GDP. That's an insane number. It's like over $1 trillion in the US, meaning it's about 4.5 trillion this year. That's a lot. So is there something more there? Probably. That's 1% of global GDP, all in that small kind of concentration. Nature typically doesn't like that kind of concentration. So maybe part of this exercise is let's follow the money. And I think part of what we as designers and engineers have to do is identify, hey, there are profits over people, what's happening, how do we start to bend that? So here's one example of that in the flesh with a very good cancer institute in New York City called Sloan Kettering, where we have Jose, who's the chief medical officer, really running rampant on ethics. From breaking conflict of interest rules, really modeling himself after Sackler. You've probably heard of Purdue, where there was an enormous amount of funkiness in how he was operating at the hospital. So New York Times and ProPublica went a little deeper, and this illustrates a few ideas that we should think about. That there was a startup that came out of the hospital called Page, interesting one actually, that had exclusive deal on the actual patient tissue samples. And yet, guess what? It was paid for by the public, the collection of those tissues, and the patient data was owned by the hospital. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 clinicians that put that together. It was hundreds of them that encoded and decoded those slides. And of course, the cherry on top is that the board of the hospital had the major stakes in that startup. Great. It gets a little better. That this is not just work amassed in a lab in a small amount of time. It was 60 in progress. It was the patient data, our data, that was owned specifically by the hospital. And, I think .orgs are just as culpable nowadays, unfortunately. Like, that signal is no longer clear of where their intentions are, meaning .org, .com, etc. Now, okay, yes, Thomas is hiding in plain sight here, but it's always interesting when someone's a research intern and CEO at the same time. But more importantly, there was a data use agreement that kept the patient tissue slides in control of the startup and not in the control of the patients. So what kind of design is this? It is, 1, we don't have, as patients, ownership rights. The IP is owned by the executives, yet we are funding it with our tax dollars. This is really just a perfect example of corporate welfare at its finest. And it's the rush for money. Its ethics is situationally optional. Look, this happens all the time in healthcare. It's not just indigenous to that one institution. It's everywhere. I don't care if you're at the NHS, if you're in California, wherever you are. It's everywhere. And so let's look at a case in point where we have the former CMO of Moderna. You may have heard of that company with its vaccines, and Michael Milken, who has his own history. They're on a podcast together right during the beginning of the pandemic. And how what I thought was interesting here is, what does Tal Zaks mean to be, I want to move to private industry from academia in order to be 1 to 3 logs more effective? Well, what does that mean? Well, in actuality, if you look at how he's selling his stock, Moderna, he was selling it at about $1 million a week, right after the U.S. public threw $1 billion at Moderna. So I don't think this is exactly a great signal for healthcare either. Now, a year later, their CEO gets $1 billion payout. I think this is a crime. And yet, this is de rigueur. I think it's insane. Okay, let's keep going here. But we are all complicit in this. We are, as global citizens, as United Statesians, we are just pushing our data everywhere without rights. And it feeds Kendall Square, Mountain View, and Moscow. So, 1, healthcare data includes more than you think. Now, this is a definition we started for Wikipedia. We seeded this several years ago, and it's finally there. But the way we sort of put together is it's any information about me that assists in making decisions about my health. Now, I think clinically, we may think of our health data as, genetics and devices and what's at the hospital. It's much more than that, as many of you know. It's really your zip code. It's how much money you make. Your salary is a vector here. So is the ability to vote. And we have a sort of a whole mapping of this, by the way. It's an open source licensed technique called determinantsofhealth.org that you can zoom in on. You can print it out. You can download it, do whatever you want. It's on GitHub. But your health data is a lot more than you think it is. And you don't own it. And you damn well should. Now, for those who are in civilization more than the United States, because we're backwards here, there's a thing called GDPR. How do you protect your information? And they actually have a pretty good start at this, where they say, hey, you control the access, you control where the data goes. Great, but they don't articulate ownership. If you go deeper into the right of access recital, nothing here about data ownership, and you really should. Why is that? Well, that's one reason is, hey, there are a lot of people who sniff and whiff your data. And this is a source diagram we put together on all the little ants that pilfer through your information. And it's, it could be pharmacy benefit managers. It could be the EHR, the electronic healthcare record. Soundarya talked about acronyms. I should stop that. The bank, the government, all these healthcare middlemen have it. It's a large list of humans and businesses who have it. If you want to take a look at this, you can download it here. Now, the hope is that this age of surveillance is going to change a bit, because my thing is that maybe health data ownership will turn it into a net positive. I hope. It's not a new idea. Hell, we were talking about it in 2006. Other people talked about it in the early 1990s. Alex talked about it even at the World Economic Forum a few years ago. But it's really the proliferation of this silicon brick that has got us closer to really thinking about it. And back in 2005, we were saying, okay, what do we need? We need a simple health data standard, and we need to own it. Yeah, this is back then already. Okay. Enough of that. So we do have some good people on our side. The former head of Brigham Health here in Boston has said we should own it. The former head of the Medicare and Medicaid Centers for in the United States, Seema Verma, said we should own their data. Okay, yes, that's good. Little side note here. Both of them have had little dings on their reputation recently. I mean, Ms. Nabel was on the board of Moderna. Seema did some other things that were a little funky. But guess what? I mention that because I'm dirty too. I've worked for all sorts of different institutions on different kind of national guidance for healthcare. I've worked at the military and healthcare industrial complexes across the US. Okay, I could be better. But there is a spectrum of dirtiness, and I just want to be very upfront about that. Okay, now back to owning your data. There's a very good paper. It's like 3 pages long, so nitwits like me can get through it, that outlines what has to happen. And of course, JAMA doesn't want to include 4 authors, but George is left out of it, and he was part of it. But the 3 components that you need for data ownership are: you need common data elements to describe the human in code. You need a patient encounter, a receipt of what happens when you go to a clinic or when you have a televisit. And then you need some kind of contract between the parties to say, okay, you did this, I did this, here's what happened. And here's the governance for that data. And just to put it in visual terms, because I like seeing it, is you have an encounter. I don't care where it is, on your phone, in the middle of a mall somewhere. I don't care. You have an encounter, and then you get this receipt of what happens in it. You get it. The clinician gets it. And there's this thing called a patient data manager, which is like your Tetris bot that puts and structures the data, puts it together, that then injects that back into your longitudinal health record. And then you have different ways of looking at that, depending on what your role is, what your responsibilities are. And then over all of that, you have a governance, some kind of agreement on, yeah, I agree to share it, or I agree to share it for a little bit, or I don't agree to share it at all. And that's what says how your data is used. Now, one little bit of this is this little patient data manager bit goes and collects your information from different encounters, from what you do at home, and then collects it and then brings it up so that you can actually see what's happening and make better and better decisions over time. So what does this get you? What does, having a little patient data manager and patient data ownership get you? Well, one thing is, how complete is your data? That's something we have no idea. How good is it? Can you make a good primary care decision on what to do next? Usually, you have, clinicians have just a handful of data points versus Meta or Google or Amazon, which have hundreds and thousands of data points about you. Who would you trust actually to make the decision based on that data, not on who would you trust to hold the data? Well, I mean, if it's a better sampling size, if you have a couple 100,000. So I think this is an important concept to think about. How do you know what data is in there? How much is in there to make better decisions? By the way, another side note, it took a bunch of overeducated MDs and PhDs to say, hey, drawing pictures helps people get stuff. Well, no kidding. But there are papers on this with metrics to say, hey, if you do techniques like this, like what I'm showing that I use all the time, that, hey, there's backup for you here. And we use this across our work, whether it's open source work where we do for the US and how COVID is working or not working, how science works. We use visual techniques in our storytelling all the time. I just think it's, I think most designers know this already, but sometimes you need like paper evidence. Someone study this. Okay, so back to owning your data. 3, when you own your data, you control access. So we talked a little bit about this. Let's just skinny this down a bit. We actually have a reference implementation of this on GitHub, and you can download it to your heart's content. And it shows, well, what can you do? How do you tell the story in a 5th grade manner, in highly visual ways, what consent is, what happens to your data. And we actually built this on top of HealthKit, so we weren't reinventing the wheel of should think about what your health record should act like. Now we're redoing this now with OpenAI and Stable Diffusion, Dance Diffusion. So we have a new version of this evolving as we speak. But this is like what we were thinking about before, and there's your health receipt on the left. And even if you're a real nerd about it, you can see where in the social determinants of health wheel your data is. That's really pretty nerdy. But we put it in there because we're nerds. So we also do different techniques. You need to build prototypes because that's what people see, because they can't necessarily articulate it for you. We also do these sort of graphic visualizations of like use cases. So it's not just written in words, but you see it happening. And there's different fidelities of this depending on where you are in the process and who the audience is. Okay. 4, owning your health data gives you health autonomy. Well, what's that mean? Well, what are the ownership rights? You can possess it, you can share it, you can sell it, and you can destroy it. Yep, your copy that you have, you can nuke it. Now, what we see here is that it's not, here are the few tenets of a data ownership, is that it's not just solely owned by you all the time, is that you own the whole kit and caboodle, all of it. Now, the second part is the generated health data about the patient by a provider, by a nurse, practitioner, et cetera, is co-owned by both parties. And that this generated data is fully owned with the patient, that they can do whatever they want with. They can sell it. They can do whatever they want. And all of these ideas should be consented in advance by the patient, other than uses required by law. Like if you have a communicable disease, the hospital has to report it, for instance. That's one example. Now, just as a flip to that, major hospitals have done the opposite of asking patients. They don't ask patients. They just start to make companies, in this case, called Truveta, where they're collecting all the health data from all the people who have been in Puget Sound region out by, Amazon headquarters to say, yeah, we're going to create a company that takes all this data and sells it to the highest bidder. Great. We had no say in that as patients. And I think this is a kind of framing, is that patient data is really like a commodity. It's like Coke, Pepsi, coal, or coffee. Makes me feel better. But we may need to think about IP a little differently, that it's time limited like copyright. Maybe there's a way that public ownership of anonymized data is the way to go. And maybe there is some kind of trust that's a third party that works on our behalf as patients, that sort of allocates with our commands where the data goes to. Now, there's some good progress in this. This is coming out notes in Boston here. I'd highly recommend checking this out if you're in the space. Where's my medical record? That starts to get to, hey, I can now edit my clinical notes and get a feedback loop going. Fantastic. Still doesn't have data ownership yet. FTC is actually handing out fines if you screw up, if companies screw up. That's good. Do I think 43 grand per violation is enough? I don't know. Maybe a tickle for most big companies. You have, .orgs and older companies actually stating that we need data ownership as part of national digital health strategy. That's good. And if you want to learn more about this, here are a few resources. I will make this PDF available to anybody who wants it. I'll post it on GitHub. And then finally, I think, while I'm not a big blockchain fan in terms of technology being the major output, the interesting thing here is that if you start to own it, you actually start to own the AI model or machine learning model against your data. That means it's a little more portable. That to me is interesting. So foundationally, any healthcare system that doesn't give you your data in you, because this last frontier of capitalism is sell your experience, to sell your mind. And these capitalists, surveillance capitalists, love to think about, wow, how do we exploit these mother scratchers? Because they won't even know what hit them. So this is why we demand patient data ownership. If you want a little more information about the data use agreements that we're using, they're on GitHub at datauseagreement.org. And, you should probably know, most of us here, what GitHub is, but all these things that I'm talking about here are open source. So why are all these goodies open? Well, my take is that you can't solve this healthcare systemic problem, at least here in the disunited States, until you ask the people to participate. And there's a classic line from the Declaration of Geneva that says, hey, I'm going to share my medical record knowledge on behalf, for the benefit of the patient and advancement of my colleagues. Okay. And then we have, PBMs going, oh yeah, I'm going to risk adjust all these cats in my black box. Well, I think I'm under maybe the illusion, or have been, that we're getting closer to care as a right, a human right. We're not there yet, because, when you use a healthcare service, you don't know how it works, why it works, if the results are true, because of the closed nature of this. And so if healthcare is so noble, if we don't really have a choice here, we really demand healthcare to be open. Look, the internet, or at least the infrastructure, is open source and a human right. Says the UN as well, it's a human right. And if you look at a pretty engineering-centric OSI model of how the internet works, most of the stack here is open source. When you look at the protocols, when you look at how it works, and yet, and you can see that we're using things that use open services, open stacks, to drive this conversation we're having now, or I should say monologue. But in healthcare, it should be open source too. And yet, according to Eric Topol, we really have anti-open source in this healthcare world. Same with energy, for that matter. And then we have friends and a colleague on our side who are in high places. And we have a pretty good example of that. My homeland of Estonia has an entire open source backbone. And, it uses some of the emerging things that are coming out of the planet and the US. Here are some examples of that. And there's some good reasons why open source healthcare is good for infrastructure, for leading edge and research, but also for this thing we're just in the long tail of right now called COVID. And it's insane. This is a great project, by the way. This came out just 2.5 months after, I think March, so it was May in 2020, the basic data definitions, open to the planet, done. Fantastic in an open source manner. You go to GitHub and you see how many repositories there are about COVID. There are 150,000 of them. That's great. And in my news feed, I'm seeing it. The Linux Foundation worked on it. MITRE worked on it. Common Health worked on it. So there's a lot of very good projects. And note that many of the projects, almost all the projects we complete here as a design studio are open source. And so all of these are available to anyone on the planet to use. Now, another good example is what happened when you have many organizations working at scale. So you've got this, Soundarya talked about, hey, she works at Meta, and that's, there are billions of people on that platform. Amazon has millions and billions. That's a different kind of scale. And so you need that to fight conditions and disease and outbreaks. And so what this coalition did around defining the data around COVID is they did it in an open source manner. The license was open across all these institutions, Mayo Clinic, you name it. Fantastic. Amazing response. Now, in the last 2 minutes here, I think on my call to you is, hey, we screwed up on the vaccine. We spent billions and billions and billions on it, and yet did not open it up to the planet. There's no margin rights. But I think we, and me as a designer, as an engineer, have to have some positions. What's your agenda as a designer? And the things that I have outlined here are things we're working on now, just FYI. And you need an agenda. You also need to say, okay, what the heck are you working on? How are we doing this? What's our focus? And so I published these, by the way. These are not closed or anything like that, along with my policy positions. You may not agree with them, fine. But at least you may know where I'm coming from, and we can talk about it. But I think that's part of the system engineering that we need to do as engineers, as designers. And I'm still looking out for who's the next Stacey Abrams for Medicare for All. We're not there yet. And we really have to be deliberate in committing to open source. We do it as a studio, and we actively go after projects that are open source. So again, these are not huge numbers, but for us, we're a small company, and it occupies a good chunk of our yearly attention. And in fact, we publish everything here. So you can actually go on our About page, and we have a working Google slide that we update weekly with our agenda. And what's the next for owning data? Ta-da! We have an open source graphic novel about, and it's available here. We have a published article that's actually going to print in a publication on Friday. So there's a lot going on. So to wrap up, healthcare and public health are a utility, a human right, and too important to be closed. And to recap, health data is more than you think it is. You don't own it. When you own your data, you control access. Owning your data gives you autonomy, and you can't solve the problems that we're having until you ask others and the people to join. And finally, having your data can save your damn life. I have stolen from these fabulous people, and they have injected my brain with smarts. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me here. Thank you very much.
Wow, you weren't lying when you said you were going on a monologue there. No, but in all honesty, I think it's a very important topic, and I think it's really good to have kind of, at least there's some people fighting for what should be happening instead of the quick and easy money.
Yes, well, I mean, money bends our minds, and I am fallible. We all are fallible. So the question is, where do you draw your integrity line? And that, to me, without integrity, you don't have much else. So it's tricky though once people throw you serious cash and a stable gig for 4 years or whatever it is, and then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, I like my sushi dinners. Yeah, and all of a sudden, just I am part of the machine. You do have to fight, and sometimes it doesn't feel like you're making progress, and that's why it just takes lots of time.
So what I'm going to do actually with my questions that I'm going to throw at you is I'm actually going to play a bit of a devil's advocate role because I'm a European, so that probably just tells you that I already believe in healthcare as a right. It's kind of just free in all the European countries and stuff like that. So I'm actually going to play the opposite. I'm going to play a devil's advocate. GDPR has given us the cookie consent banners that it's kind of the stats on it is people just click OK and they don't even think about it. They don't care. It's just more of an annoyance. Would asking people to own or make any decisions about their healthcare record, would it just be a case of another cookie consent banner where people just go, OK, OK, OK?
So I think that's a brutally pointed question because it preys well and on purpose on how humans operate, which is we really don't want to think about it. So I agree with that concept wholeheartedly. Is nobody in the right mind wants to think about their health data. Unless you're a wonk and you're speaking to one, right? And so, but no human wants to do that. So I think there is good reason to believe that people will slide through many of this. I still want the protection. So the thing is, there in this country and in the EU, I want that protection, regardless of whether I give a crap about it or not. I want it in law. I want there to be governance. I want there to be rules in order, if they're bent, then I want people to, pay the consequences or understand the consequences. Right now, there are no rules on that, especially in the United States and many places on the planet. So I'd rather have the rules started for us to figure out, okay, well, maybe this little bot will take over some of the thinking, so to speak, for me, and I don't have to do all of it. And I'm just advocating that little thing as a lawyer on my behalf, and I don't have to think about it. So I buy your argument in terms of human behavior. I don't buy it in the other way that I need there to be rule over my data that people need to adhere to. Make sense?
Great. So yeah, no, it does. But I'm gonna hit one back at you now as well. So one of the challenges, I guess, in something as complex as healthcare, and I've worked on projects where we're trying to define the rules, or as you would say, the kind of common data elements. And there's the argument that you only really discover them as you kind of build the system and then you start seeing more use cases and figure out how you need to change it. And there's an argument that regulation and locking them down would stifle innovation in the space. So if you overregulate, it will stifle innovation. So what's your kind of feeling there?
Well, a couple things. That same argument was made when GDPR was in its birthing process. And to your point, well, people skip through it, and it hasn't stopped anything in terms of innovation. You look at what's happening in NHS in London and the huge, vast amount of data they're collecting because patients want to give back to science. I'd say it's over, I think it's 55% of patients now versus like 3 years ago. It was much higher 3 years ago. But over half of the population would give their data to science, for instance. And that's pretty remarkable. I mean, if you're getting half the population, because I'm U.S. centric and it's all about the U.S. There's no other countries out there. That's 150 million people, right? More saying yes, and that is a huge sample. Is it as much as what OpenAI uses right now in the billions or trillions? No, but it is a huge sample. The second part of that is you can synthesize now personal data pretty damn well. And you can use services like Cynthia, which is an open source patient health generator, data generator, which allows huge swaths, not just towns, but states of people to be generated in order for you to try your health policy on, your health ideas or software on. And that to me is also very promising.
Excellent. Yeah, and I'm going to do the last devil's advocate question. these organizations that have all of this data, they don't have the skill set to do anything with it. Their skill set lies in providing healthcare, not in analyzing data. So is it such a bad thing for them to partner with companies, and those companies need to be able to make some money to invest in it, to be able to do something and get some value out of that data?
Yeah, well, you're making the assumption that so there's a couple parts to that. One is, okay, so maybe data is now becoming a skill for hospital systems, right? Because they have to report on it anyways. They have like state and federal rules, again, here in the United States. So there's some basic data understanding. Have they made full light or a third light of what's there? I agree with you, probably not, because we don't see any of that excellence or data understanding when we go back for a second visit. They're like, oh, you're coming for a second time? Oh yeah, we know that because you paid by credit card, but where's the rest of your data, right? They know your money. But I'm being a little facetious, but it's true. I think there are reasons for them to hire people who are very good at getting data and doing things with data. I don't have a problem with that, because they also will co-own part of your record because they're delivering service to you. And that's part of the, not bartering, but part of the reason to go to a hospital. They also have a reason legally to keep it, because they have to prove that they did things with you, to you, etc. That's the whole nothing without me, nothing about me without me. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to have experts come in, or people who are very good at data wrangling, do that with the permission, with the known permission from the parties involved. I think that's completely reasonable.
Excellent. Well, that's me playing devil's advocate finished. So I think that's all the questions. Alicia has just said thank you for bringing the information. So she's enjoyed it.
So I put people to sleep. That's good.
No, I think it is. It's definitely an area. I'm hugely optimistic about what AI, just after having seen the kind of the protein folding improvements on DeepMind and things like that. That I think once you start getting enough of a data sample out there, we're going to start seeing patterns and trends that we didn't even know existed. So I'm optimistic in this space.
The cost of intelligence is dropping like a rock. And that is particularly amazing and scary at the same time.
Yeah, but I'm an ever optimist, so I like to look on the bright side of it. But anyway, that brings us to time. So once again, thank you, Juhan, for sharing how we're going to get towards open health.
Anytime.
Excellent. So that brings us to the end for our event today. But I do want to say, if you did enjoy that and you want to hear more about how teams can help improve their processes and change how they're working so that they can become move more towards that empowered autonomous product team approach, we do have larger conferences, one of which is our upcoming one in New York in May. We'll have 25 speakers, 8 workshops. There'll be 800 people there. It's a fantastic venue and it's a fantastic event. So if you are looking to come, we have what we call our blind sale on that ends at the end of this week. So we will be it's called a blind sale because we're releasing our agenda next week. So you can get the cheapest price now before the agenda goes live. But otherwise, you can wait and see some of the amazing speakers that we have lined up for this. But thank you for joining us. I hope to see you at the next event and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.